things I saw was the sort of engagement with the human condition. I mean, that's the first thing that struck me. And it's very ascetic, almost severe sparseness. And the sign of any good picture is it will draw you in initially, but then if it's a good picture, it won't release you quickly.
He found his niche, and he was singular in his vision in that he didn't really care. I mean, I would ask him, what do you think about having a retrospective somewhere? And he would say, like, I really don't care. And he'd still be out in the studio working and looking for that elusive masterpiece that he probably felt he never found.
I think that Bob painted supposedly lonely people because he felt that's how people were, that's how he felt. So he put himself into the people as well, I think.
As I got to know Bob, he didn't have much truck with trying to do abstract work. It didn't engage him at all as a practitioner. And as a painter, Bob's compositional sense doesn't really change. It's pretty solid all the way through. There are always those specific Spartan elements. The thing that struck me also was the universal nature of his compositions. You know, they'd often have particular names or titles referring to, say, Eddy Avenue or Shoalhaven, places like that. And they're kind of recognisable, but he pushes it into a non-kind of parochial space. And that gives it a real strength, I think. There's a sense of theatre, his sense of the aloneness. You know, we enter the world, we enter this life alone, and we exit alone. So there's those things going on. There's that other painting comes to mind, these tower blocks, and they're kind of anonymous, and they look somewhere between an urban slum and a gulag. But then in the foreground, you're drawn to this moment of intimacy between this couple. It's a little poetic touch that he gives to bring that intimacy back. And then you suddenly realise, well, in each room in that anonymous block, there are all these little lives going on. He's very classical in his sensibility. Even a painting like The Strikers, there's a little bit of movement, you know, those little spaces between the figures. And you see this lineup of men, which is very subtly composed by Bob. You always get a sense of an individual consciousness.
Bob told me that as a boy, he and his brother used to visit the museum, and apparently they were 7 and 9 or something, and they would copy things. But Bob said they loved doing it, and that was his beginnings. And actually, he left school at 13. He wanted to go on then, he said. He wanted to do the junior, but his father thought it was a waste of money and time, and Bob should be working. And Bob, by then, was probably 14, and he must have decided that he was sick of being bullied and he would learn boxing, and that was what kids did in those days. There wasn't always much food on the table. They ate very poorly, but he could make £5 boxing. He was told to fall down in the 3rd or the 4th or whatever, and he would get his £5, but because he knew he was not going to win that night, he'd bet on the other fellow beforehand, and so he could turn his £5 into 15. He didn't stay at home very long. When he was 18, he joined the Air Force. When the war ended, Bob was stuck in Borneo for 12 months, and he started to use the camouflage paint and bits of tents to make canvases. And there was, you know, black and brown and green, I think, and a lot of his early paintings do show this palette. Bob told me once that his first major influence on his painting was reading The Moon and Sixpence when he was waiting to be demobbed during the war. And he thought then he wanted to be a painter, and that was why he told the rehab people he wanted to do art. They could have sent him to art school, but they didn't think he was educated enough. And he probably didn't look the style anyway. He would have gone in his singlet and his shorts. So they did what they thought was right and sent him off to lay bricks. Then he and his wife lived in a caravan at the Blu-ray Gas Company. Bob had been given a sort of caretaker job. He had to fill the gas cylinders, but he had a lot of time off, so he started painting in the evenings, and he would paint in the men's toilets. And it was through his friendship with his old friend Billy Sewell that he got to know painters, the Boyds and the Percival, and then began to send to Melbourne, and he sent to the Antipodean show in Melbourne, partly because he knew, well, John Brack, and John Brack wrote to him and said, we're having this show, and sent him the Antipodean Manifesto. So Bob started showing then in the contemporary art shows, and there were some in Sydney, but mostly in Melbourne. Bob was prepared to do all sorts of things for charity, and he painted a fridge for the Woman's Weekly quite early on. I think he may have been recommended for this by Arthur Boyd, and it may have been a turning point for him. I don't know how much money they gave, but Bob never had much money anyway. Then Rudy Comans took him up and coerced Bob into shows, and Bob agreed and had shows. I don't think Bob's introduction to the art world changed him very much. He was invited to a party by Rudy and turned up in his singlet and shorts, and the people at the door turned him away. He got to meet a lot of other artists, and that was a good thing for him. But he couldn't always understand why other artists didn't see the same vision as him sometimes. Well, we have a pool here, and he used to swim every day, half an hour, and quite heavily into the winter. He didn't like being sick at all. You know, he liked to be well. After Bundanon, when we moved to this house, and that's 20 years ago, they'd made a 3-kilometre track, and Bob would walk the track 3 times perhaps. So he was a very disciplined person.
I love the mythical question of spending a day in the studio with Bob, because it would just never happen. All of my childhood was spent not being allowed to go in the studio. He was very defensive about who was allowed to look at his work, and he was very protective about that. The drive to keep working and keep painting was like a drug to a point, but it was certainly something that kept him active and alive well into his early 90s, which is pretty impressive. Yeah, he certainly had a nagging voice of some sort that was driving him on. If he didn't do it, he wasn't alive.
I think that he felt, while he was alive, that his paintings were ephemeral, because he once carried a painting on the bus, and a big one, into the rocks, and suddenly Bob realised he was stuck at the rocks with this big painting, and so he threw it in the water. I said, why did you do that? And he said, because it was too hard to carry home on the bus, and I can paint it again anyway. So he really felt while he was alive he could reproduce these things because they were in his head.
There's over 100 works that we have to find homes for, and I know his ethos would have been to make sure that everybody enjoys them. He wouldn't necessarily want them all sold to private collectors. That was never his aim. He always painted with the view of sharing his work with as many people as possible, and making sure that people that wanted to see it could see it.
He speaks to people. That's his subject. His subject is us. And in that sense, it's universal, because we don't really change as people. You know, all the bits and the bobs change. We have different technologies. But the drivers, the love, the hate, the passions, and that thing of being alone, being together, which is very much in Bob's work, that's not going to go anywhere.